Well, good morning, Indian Creek. It is good to be back with you this morning. For those who don't know me, my name is Kevin O'Brien. I'm sort of the utility reliever for all of our various campuses. And this morning, I do not have a Father's Day sermon for you that would be typical. Because as you see, we're continuing our series. For those who don't know me, I am the executive editor of a small ministry called Apollos Watered. And if you're looking for a Father's Day thing, this week we are releasing on our podcast an interview with Nancy Pearcey on her brand new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, which is an interesting Father's Day tie-in. So if you really need that, you can go there. So it's amazing how routine and perception sort of impact the way that we view the world, the way we think about things, the way that we engage with what's going on around us, even as Christians, right? It's remarkable to me, and I saw this firsthand, how you throw off routine this morning. At about 7:30 this morning, I'm getting ready to get up. I'm hearing a hair dryer going in the other room because my daughter is getting ready to go to the early service at Sugar Grove. And suddenly I hear at the very same time out of my left ear outside a very loud crack, and the hairdryer went away on the inside because a transformer blew in our neighborhood. And so no power. And suddenly I'm getting ready in the dark. And, I got a little lantern as I'm taking a shower this morning. It was weird. And it's amazing how our perception really does impact the way we see things. I walked in this morning and Josh looked at me and said, "That's an interesting shirt. That's an interesting statement you're making, Kevin." Because what do you expect when the guy gets up to preach? You expect a collared shirt, maybe a jacket. And here I am with an African shirt. And if you know me, this doesn't fit me at all. This is not something you would normally see from me, but it's a shirt my mother got for me the last time she was in Uganda visiting my sister. And occasionally I pull it out just to keep people guessing. Because perception really does matter, doesn't it? And you know the term pigeonholed? Right? It started in the 1600s. In desks in England, they would have these little cubbies that they'd stick letters in, right? And they were similar to the small little boxes that they would put pigeons or doves in to have nests, because they ate a lot of pigeon in England at the time. Now, we don't use the term pigeonholed in that way today, but it still does refer to a small space. Like we usually, it's sometimes things, but more often people, we get a very small perception of who a person is or what they're about, right? We reduce an entire person to one aspect of who they are. And sometimes it's about their success, right? They do this one thing really well at work, and so that's the only thing we accept, we see them as. It's the only thing we allow them to do or to be. They did something so well that that's all they are. And a long time ago, I was a book and Bible buyer for a chain of Christian bookstores, and audio Bibles were a big deal at the time. And there was one particular recording I remember that a lot of people really liked, and I just could not listen to it. It was a King James Bible, and it wasn't that it was the King James. That wasn't the reason why I couldn't listen to it. It wasn't that the recording was bad. It was actually very well done. And the voice actor had a very deep, rich baritone voice. But to me, James Earl Jones will always be Darth Vader. And I don't want Darth Vader reading the Bible to me. I just don't, it's not going to work for me. It's got nothing to do with the quality of it, but I had pigeonholed him in my mind, and I couldn't get around that. And today we come to the disciple who has been pigeonholed perhaps more than any other disciple. because we never give him just his name. We never talk about Thomas. It's always Doubting Thomas. When I was a kid in the 70s, and it was kind of nice to hear a Keith Green song this morning during worship. When I was a kid in the 70s, we used to sing a hymn that had part of the lyrics, "Don't be a doubting Thomas, rest fully in his promise, why worry, 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 worry when you can pray." Now what doubt and worry, exactly how that lines up, I'm not sure. And as we're going to see from the passage this morning, that's not exactly what's going on there. But this morning, we're going to look at how our perceptions of Thomas are perhaps more colored than we think, how he is far more than just doubting Thomas. And we're going to spend all of our time in the book of John today. So if you want to turn to John 20, that's where we're going to start. We're going to be in several different passages. And I want us to see more than anything else today that Thomas is about much more than just his doubt. Would you pray with me? Father, we thank you for your church, for being able to come together to worship you, to learn from your word, to fellowship with one another. And I pray this morning that as we continue to look at the life of the disciples and Thomas, that we would see you more clearly because of it, and we would understand just a little bit more how we are to live in light of who you are. And it's in Christ's name I pray. Amen. So Thomas is one of the 12. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all give lists of the 12 disciples. Luke does it twice in his gospel and in Acts. John never gives a list. He doesn't actually even list, or he doesn't mention all of the 12. Most of them, but not all of them. And when we look at the list, we find that there are some small differences, like the order of the names changes a little bit, and there's this guy, Thaddeus, who's also named Judas, not Iscariot, or Judas, son of James. And I suppose if your name was Judas after the fact, you wouldn't want to be known by that either, right? So I get that. But even with the small changes, there's a very interesting pattern that's very consistent in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that's this: Peter's always first, Philip is always fifth, and James the son of Alphaeus is always ninth. And what does that mean? Well, scholars tell us probably what this means is that there's 3 groups of 4 disciples. There's the inner circle, Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And Philip is the leader of the second group. And James the son of Alphaeus is the leader of the third group. And Thomas always shows up in the second group. He's second string, as it were. And we don't know a whole lot. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Thomas never speaks, not once. John gives us a little bit more information. Several times he calls him Didymus. Thomas called Didymus, which means twin. So he's got a twin out there somewhere, but we don't know who. And John gives us 3 times where Thomas, the second string guy, takes center stage. And the first one is the one that it's not the first one, but we're going to start with the one that we all know. Because after all, what is Thomas famous for? He's famous for his doubt. And this is John chapter 20, and we're going to start looking at verse 19. It's Resurrection Sunday. And Mary has seen Jesus, and Peter and John have had the race to the tomb, and no one is quite sure exactly what to do. You see, there's definitely hope going on, but also, what does verse 19 say? When it was evening on that first day of the week, the disciples were gathered together, and the doors were locked because they feared the Jews. They're afraid. Remember, the events of the Passion Week aren't a distant it's not a distant memory for them. It just happened. And there's tension in the city. They know there have been illegal trials and mobs, and I've got to believe they're thinking, if they killed Jesus, why wouldn't they kill us too? Because we know what happened. And Jesus appears. And in verse 19, he offers peace. Peace be with you. And then in verse 21, he gives them a commission. As the Father has sent me, I am also sending you. Talk about a turn of events. And then we come to verses 24 and 25. But Thomas, called Twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were telling him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "If I don't see the mark of the nails in his hands, put my finger into the mark of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will never believe." Now, I'm going to admit something that most preachers are never going to say from pulpit. I get Thomas. I don't mean just I understand him. I get him. You see, faith comes hard for me, personally. I am a skeptic by nature. Maybe it's personality, maybe it's I am a member of Generation X, and most of us are a little bit skeptical as a rule. But I'm the kind of guy who says, I need you to prove it to me with 3 different kinds of evidence, and if there's a hole in your argument, I'm going to find it. I was on the debate team in college, and we were good. Thank you very much. That's the way that I view the world, so I get Thomas. And we look around and politicians and scandals and people trying to sell us something. And it's not hard to feel that way, right? And after all, the Bible warns us. In Jeremiah 17, we're warned, don't trust in people, trust in God. In verse 19 of Jeremiah 17, famously says that the heart is deceitful above all things. It says it's incurable. And Jesus says in Mark 7 that evil comes from within, including deceit. And we've all known people, perhaps even ourselves, who have been self-deceived, haven't we? Deceived because they want something to be true. Because our own hearts lie. We're told, follow your heart, but if we stop and think about it, we know that sometimes our hearts lie. But this story is about more than that. This is more than Thomas not wanting to be tricked. There's a reason we call him Doubting Thomas. He did doubt. He wasn't there. And unlike what many modern skeptics say, those first century people were just gullible and didn't understand what death is. The truth of the matter is, first century people probably understood death more than most of us because they lived with it in ways that we hide away in the corner. And I have the feeling that Thomas was the guy saying, look, guys, I loved him too. I followed him. You know, I've been around for 3 years, but we saw what happened, and dead people do not crawl off of crosses alive. It doesn't happen. I don't believe you. Being skeptical in that sense of not just believing anyone or anything is not wrong in of itself. But being skeptical when we shouldn't, that's another story. You see, the passage goes on. It's a week later, and Thomas is with the other 10, because there's only 11 of them now. And Jesus appears again in verse 26, right? And then he singles out, and Jesus singles out Thomas. He says, peace, and then verse 27. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it by my side. Don't be faithless, but believe. Thomas, do you need proof? Here it is. Empirical proof right in front of you. Flesh and blood. It's me. Don't be faithless, but believe. You see, there's a difference between healthy skepticism on the one hand and faithlessness on the other hand. And Thomas is wrong not to believe the 10 and Mary and the other women. Acts chapter 1 happens a month and a half, 2 months later. And what do we read there? There's about 120 people gathered. It's not just the 11 and Mary. There's more going on. And when a healthy distrust, a justified understanding of the deceitfulness of humanity becomes cynicism, there's a problem. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how does Thomas, who has spent 3 years with Jesus, Thomas, who is famous for doubt, how did he get there? How did he get to that point? And to find that out, we're going to go back in time to that first episode that John features. It's only back a few pages in John chapter 11. And here we move from Thomas being famous for doubt to Thomas being fatalistically determined. Perhaps you were here for our series in John. Perhaps you need a refresher. In John chapter 10, Jesus and the disciples are near Jerusalem. They're preaching, and the Jews are going to stone Jesus for blasphemy. He's claimed to be God. So Jesus and the disciples retreat northward to where John the Baptist had been ministering. It's at least a day's journey, probably closer to 3. We don't know exactly where it was at. And at the beginning of chapter 11, we find out that Lazarus is sick. Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha, and the 3 of them live in Bethany, a town just outside of Jerusalem, and they're close friends with Jesus. In the second half of the chapter, Jesus raises Lazarus in the final sign before Jesus' death and resurrection. And we can't get into that this morning. We don't have the time for that. We want to focus on Thomas's part in this story. So look at verse 8. Verse 8, Rabbi, the disciples told him, that's Jesus, just now the Jews tried to stone you, and you're going there again? You're going back to Jerusalem? The disciples are afraid. They knew there was real danger going back to Jerusalem. It's only been a short time, and according to John's chronology in chapter 12, this is maybe a week and a half before Jesus is crucified. They had reason to be afraid. And they're also confused because Jesus has said that this sickness is not going to end in death. Okay. And then in verse 11, Jesus says, our friend Lazarus is asleep. I'm on my way to wake him up. And they're confused and they're saying, well, if he's just asleep and he's going to wake up, why do we need to go there and get to this dangerous space? This doesn't make sense to us, Jesus. Why would we do this? And then we find verse 13. Jesus, however, was speaking about his death, but they thought he was speaking about natural sleep. So Jesus then told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him. Then Thomas, called Twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too so that we may die with him. Thomas completely understood the situation. He read it perfectly well. And still, he chose to go with Jesus to Jerusalem. And not only to go with Jesus, but to get the other guys to go along with to Jerusalem. He believed that he was going to go to Jerusalem and die. Now think about that. He knows the power set against them, and he still goes. He is not faithless. He was committed to Jesus, committed to their mission, even in the face of death. But there is an air of fatalism there, isn't there? Thomas may believe, but he doesn't see a way out. He's got tunnel vision. And for those of us who have a skeptical sort of bent, this is a danger. When we finally do put our trust in something, we're all in, even fatalistically in. And we might assess the situation perfectly well, humanly speaking, but we can get stuck in what we know, in the bigness of the situation, and we can forget that God is bigger than the situation. Thomas couldn't see that. He missed the larger plan because he couldn't get beyond his own perceptions. We can be loyal but equally pessimistic, and I see this a lot in the church today. A fatalism that we can't possibly see a way out of the situation around us in the culture. We have to compromise and do this or that because we don't see that God is bigger than the situation. And when that happens, like Thomas, who is famous for doubt, that fatalistic determination can leave us foundering in distress. John 14. You see, it's a week later, less than a week later. It's the night of Judas's betrayal. It's the upper room. Jesus has washed the disciples' feet and the Last Supper has taken place. Peter's denial has just been predicted by Jesus, and we are in Jesus' last teaching, which we call the upper room discourse. Right? The last teaching of Jesus to his disciples. And this is what the beginning of chapter 14 says. Jesus says, "Don't let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going away to prepare a place for you? If I go away and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am, you may be also. You know the way to where I am going." "Lord," Thomas said, "we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" Jesus told him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will also know my Father. From now on, you know him and have seen him." Don't let your hearts be troubled, verse 1. Why was he say this? Because their hearts are troubled. In verse 5, who speaks up? Thomas speaks up. The guy who was willing to come to die. "We don't know where you're going, Jesus. How can we know the way?" You can practically hear the distress in the statement. "What is this, Jesus? You're leaving us? We believed in you. We followed you. Even here now, when we know they're after you, they're after us. What are we supposed to do here?" It feels like the rug has been pulled out from under. The things that Thomas has held most sacred, the things that we hold most sacred, the things that keep us stable are now suspect. What are we supposed to do? How do we keep going? And I don't think Thomas is saying anything different than what the other guys are thinking and feeling. I think he's got the guts to say it out loud. I think that's the difference. The others are clearly worried too. And Jesus tells them, look, you don't understand. He's not talking about fleeing. He's not talking about some secret hideout, some secret fortress where they can go and live in peace away from the pressures of the culture around them. It's not what he's offering them. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. Jesus, for 3 years with these guys, has preached the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is at hand. God has come near. And they don't understand the nature of the kingdom quite yet. They don't understand that Jesus reconciles us to the Father in a surprising and sacrificing way. They will very soon, but they don't get it all yet. And Jesus says, you want to be with the Father? You can. But only through me. You know me, you know the Father. And if you've seen him, you've seen me. If you've seen him, something no one can do and live, according to Jewish belief, you've seen God if you've seen me. Jesus has upended reality, but Thomas and the rest don't know it yet. Is it any wonder he's doubting? Is it any wonder that he's in distress at this point? But I believe that this statement of Jesus in John 14 is at work in Thomas in a way that even he does not yet understand. I think these words are going to play in his mind, in the back of his mind, in the coming days and in the weeks to come. You know what an earworm is? Those songs that get stuck in your head and they can't get out. I can't stand ABBA. I can't stand ABBA, which is particularly bad for me because my daughter ran sound and lights for the high school musical a couple years ago, which was the Mamma Mia thing. And I don't like ABBA in part because it's all hook and you can't get it out of your head. And I think that that's what goes on with Jesus' words to Thomas right here. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. He doesn't get it, but it's an earworm and it's stuck there. And so now we go back to that night where we started in John chapter 20. 8 days after the resurrection, and Jesus has just reached out to Thomas. Look, Thomas, it's me. I understand your distress. I understand your doubt. I understand that you don't understand. It's time for you to put that behind you. Reach out your hand. And then we hear Thomas's fundamental declaration in verses 28 and 29 of John 20. Thomas responded to him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." My Lord and my God. Famous for doubt, fatalistic determination, foundering into distress, to a fundamental declaration. How does he get here? After all they've been through, after all they've seen, the fear and the disbelief, it would have been easy for Thomas to run and hide. But Thomas didn't. Not ultimately. Now, there's no doubt that both he and the other 10 had stumbled. Peter had followed at a distance, but then denied Jesus. John perhaps was in that room at where the trials were. And he was there at the cross for Jesus to entrust his mother into his care. But like the other 8, Thomas wasn't. And then he wasn't there that first night, but now he is, and he is confronted by Jesus. It's not a harsh confrontation. It's not an accusing confrontation, but it is a confrontation. Jesus forces Thomas to come to grips both with the reality of his own resurrection and with the reality of Thomas's own disbelief. And that's what Jesus does. Disbelief that to Thomas might have still looked like faithfulness. After all, he showed up, didn't he? He didn't have to. After all of this, he was the only one that really, really saw and convinced the other guys to come. He's the one that spoke up when the others didn't. And now he is confronted with Jesus, whom he sees clearly. My Lord and my God, he says. The most fundamental declaration any person, any Christian could make about Jesus. This is the opposite of doubt, the opposite of fatalism, the opposite of distress. This is belief, not an idea, not a statement, a deep down in your soul kind of belief and change. And the resurrected Jesus will do that to you. And I believe that Jesus' statement from John 14, I am the way, the truth, and life, is echoing in the back of Thomas's brain right then. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will also know the Father. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Because see, Jesus shatters every doubt. He shatters our own determined fatalism. He shatters our distress because of who he is and what he's done. He did it for Thomas. He does it for us. Those of us who have not seen and yet believe. And sometimes we need that reminder, and Thomas, I believe, gives it to us. I appreciate Thomas for that. for being the guy who doesn't fit the mold, who is a skeptic and yet believes. But there's one last time that John shows us that Thomas is now faithfully devoted. You probably don't even have to turn the page. John chapter 21 and verse 2. And we know John chapter 21 as the restoration of Peter along the shores of Galilee. As Peter is denied 3 times, and Jesus is going to 3 times give him the opportunity to be restored. In verse 3, Peter says, I'm going fishing. Right? He's going back to business. But take a look at verse 2. Simon Peter, Thomas, called twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 others of the disciples were gathered together. Who's at the shores of the Sea of Galilee when Peter is restored? 7 guys. And Thomas is suddenly not in the second string. He's the second guy mentioned. Zebedee's sons, James and John, are part of the inner circle, and Thomas is mentioned before them. 2 aren't even named. I'm pretty sure Andrew's probably one of them. But I think, this is dangerous territory, I admit that, but I think we see a change in status here for Thomas. I think Thomas has moved. He is faithfully devoted and is now at the heart of things. Which is interesting because Thomas only shows up one more time in the New Testament, and that's in the list that Luke gives to us in Acts. We don't read about him. There are no letters from him. But church history isn't silent about Thomas. In fact, after Jesus, and then Peter, and then John, Thomas becomes the most mentioned disciple in church history. And now for those of you who are old enough, I'm going to pull my Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Thomas, starting in the 2nd century, there's a bunch of apocryphal books about him. What is an apocryphal book? An apocryphal book is a book that names somebody as the author, and it wasn't him who actually wrote it, but tells us stuff about what's going on and what people were thinking. About 20 years ago, one of these apocryphal books, the Gospel of Thomas, became really popular when Dan Brown wrote a book called The Da Vinci Code. Okay? Look, some of these texts include heretical stuff and Gnostic stuff. They make Jesus less than he was. But through them and other sources, we do catch glimpses of the actual Thomas's devotion, faithful devotion. The stories don't always match, but universally, we know Thomas is associated with India. It seems that Thomas, unlike most of the other disciples who went west or south, he went east. He went to Parthia, which is an empire to the east of Rome, and Persia in modern Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, which is not far from India. Remember, ancient boundaries are a little bit different than they are today. And in the 2nd to 3rd century book, The Acts of Thomas, while probably closer to historical fiction in some ways, it speaks of Thomas going to northwest India to a king who was otherwise unknown to history until the 1830s, when in the Kabul Valley of Afghanistan, a treasure trove of coins was found with this king's name on it. Remember, 3rd century, 200s, is when these stories of Thomas had come. And suddenly in the 1830s, this king's name is showing up. It seems that Thomas first goes to northwest India. Okay, we've got that. In the 1500s, the Portuguese landed in southwest India. You see, in the Roman times, there had been a thriving trade, but for several hundred years, almost 1,000 years, it was not particularly safe. And when the Portuguese showed up to what is now the southwestern state of Kerala, the bottom tip of India, they found indigenous Christians. Christians who claimed Thomas as their founder. And it seems that Thomas had encountered some kind of trouble in northwest India, and he left and he took a boat and in AD 52 landed in Kerala. And we know that this was possible because a Roman fort has been found in southern India. We know that there was a Jewish colony in southern India at the time. And it was funny because recently on that podcast I mentioned, we interviewed a guy named Sam George. That's about the whitest name you've ever heard in your life, but Sam is Indian. And my friend Travis asked Sam, so tell me about your family. When did your family become Christians? And Sam says, oh, my family have been Christians since at least the 12th century. That's the 1100s. I can barely trace my family back to the 18th century, and that's only because of the work my dad has done on all of this stuff. Let alone say that they were Christians since then. And like the stories in the North, the stories in the South have exaggerations, and sometimes they're not completely consistent, but the core is this. Thomas lands by boat in AD 52. He evangelized among the high castes and began churches. He probably went to China and returned. He was martyred by spear in Chennai, formerly Madras, a city on the southeastern side, in 72 AD. And what we find is the guy who is known for doubt traveled further than any other disciple, well over 3,000 miles, just to southern India. His faithful devotion to Jesus after being confronted by his risen Lord was second to none. And for us today, Thomas's life, his personality, his faith, they raise several key questions. It's not wrong to be a realist, to test to see whether or not things are true. It's not wrong to question what we don't understand. All of those things can be quite healthy. But I have to ask, and partially for myself, are we paying attention to the light God has given us, or are we falling prey to our skepticism and perhaps cynicism? Do we think that we have all of the information, or are we open to being challenged when we need to be? Because our perceptions may be coloring the way we think of things. We may say, "Oh, that shirt doesn't go there," and get distracted by that instead of the message. And God reveals himself to us in his word, and as Thomas should have understood through the faith of his fellow believers as well. If Thomas was quite the determined realist he thought he was, he would have stopped to think for a moment about the source of the claims that those people that he had spent 3 years with said, "We have seen Jesus." He may have had a different response. After all, none of them had stayed strong. Not just him. And yet they said, "We've seen him." Peter had denied Jesus. Everyone knew of the crucifixion, and yet now they're all claiming that he was alive. And they didn't dismiss or contradict the women who came to them and said it first, even though in that world no woman could testify in court. They didn't challenge that. And that's what would have been expected. Are we willing to change our view when confronted by Jesus like Thomas did? Remember, Thomas was a believer already and he got stuff wrong. Really important stuff. And we as believers, we need to be willing to change when we are confronted by Jesus and his words, and we all have that in our lives. Are we willing to let the skeptic have space to ask hard questions and perhaps even be cynical so that they too can be confronted by the risen Jesus? Or do we just write them off? We may not have all the answers, but Jesus does, and he loves them just as much as he loves us. And finally, are we as faithfully devoted as Thomas is? Are we willing to let God challenge us in such a way that we're willing to go to people unlike us to different cultures, to different customs, to opposition and hardship, so that the good news of Jesus Christ can be heard. Thomas went farther than any other of the remaining disciples. Here's the thing, we don't have to. Because the world is at our doorstep. Literally, right here. But also, increasingly, across the street. Our neighbors. Last week, I was speaking in Naperville. And according to the Naperville School District website, 84 languages are spoken in Naperville. Think about that. 84 languages. In our building, our campus in Naperville, there is a Korean church and an Indian church that meet there. We don't have to travel to reach out, but we do have to be willing to be uncomfortable. To understand that those who are not like us and reach out. I don't know if you've ever been to our Aurora campus or not, but it is by far our most diverse campus. Lots of refugees and immigrants there from around the world. And as they say there, awkward is awesome, because it is learning to be with people who are not like us. To learn from them as much as to teach. And Thomas allowed Jesus to turn his doubts and his realism into a means for the good news to spread around the world. And when we are confronted by Jesus, I pray that our response is the same as Thomas's. My Lord and my God. Because he understood the implication for the rest of his life. He was faithfully devoted.